Close your eyes and imagine a world cloaked in shadows, a world where knowledge was forbidden, streets were lit only by torchlight, and people whispered stories in fear of being accused of heresy. That's the image we've been taught to believe about the Middle Ages, a dark, ignorant, filthy time where superstition ruled and progress died. But what if that wasn't the truth? What if the stories we've heard about the so-called Dark Ages weren't just exaggerated, but intentionally crafted? What if the chaos, the filth, the backwardness was part of a carefully built lie? The term Dark Ages wasn't even used until centuries after the time had passed. It was popularized during the Renaissance, a period where thinkers wanted to paint themselves as the rebirth of brilliance after a long sleep. To do that, they needed a contrast, so they drew the curtain of darkness over everything that came before them. They said the medieval world had lost all connection to classical knowledge. They said people stopped reading, thinking, and building. But that simply wasn't true. In quiet monasteries, monks were copying ancient texts by candlelight, preserving Greek philosophy, Roman law, and scientific ideas on fragile parchment. Universities were being founded, places like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, where students debated logic, theology, astronomy. The medieval world didn't abandon learning. It was safeguarding it, evolving it, passing it forward in whispers and ink. Still, the myth was more convenient. If you wanted to justify a new power structure, you painted the past as a mistake. If you were trying to rewrite history to elevate your nation, your religion, or your ideology, it helped to call the old world backward, even barbaric, and so the lie grew, a slow creeping distortion that turned scholars into fools, doctors into butchers, kings into tyrants, and artists into ghostly unknowns. The lie turned one of the most complex, dynamic periods in human history into a dark cartoon. The real Middle Ages were filled with invention, mechanical clocks, eyeglasses, windmills. People were travelling, trading, translating texts across continents. Entire cities rose with soaring cathedrals and intricate guild systems. There were revolutions of thought, clashes of empire, vast networks of trade and diplomacy. But those stories didn't fit the neat narrative. It was easier to say, they didn't know better. It was easier to laugh at them, to dismiss their fears, to mock their beliefs. It made the modern age feel smarter, stronger, cleaner. It made us feel better about who we are by pretending they were so much worse. And so the truth was buried beneath layers of ridicule, forgotten books, and dusty museum labels. But what happens when we start to peel those layers back? When we stop laughing at the Middle Ages and start listening to them, you'll find a world that's more vibrant, more complicated, and more eerily familiar than you were ever told. A world full of thinkers, rebels, dreamers, and secrets that someone didn't want you to remember. Imagine standing in the courtyard of a medieval city at dawn. The sky is still grey, and the stone beneath your feet is cold, but the streets are beginning to stir. A baker opens his shutters, a distant bell tolls from a church tower, and somewhere in the market square merchants are laying out their goods, silks from the east, spices that came by camel and ship, scrolls written in languages you don't even recognise. This is not the world of mud and misery that we've been told to expect. This is a world of movement, connection, and curiosity. And yet, that's not how it's remembered. Why? Because history isn't just written by the victors, it's shaped by the storytellers. And for centuries, those storytellers were focused on something else, building a myth of progress that left the Middle Ages behind like a bad dream. The Renaissance scholars, the Enlightenment philosophers, even Victorian schoolmasters, all needed a contrast. They needed a before to make their after shine brighter. So they built a version of the medieval world where people thought the earth was flat, where medicine was just superstition, where no one bathed and no one questioned. But none of that was really true. In cathedral schools and Islamic libraries, People debated the shape of the earth centuries before Columbus ever sailed. Medieval physicians studied anatomy, wrote complex medical texts, and even performed surgeries with anesthesia made from herbs. Public bathhouses dotted towns across Europe, some so grand they rivaled Roman ones, and questions? They were everywhere, about nature, about God, about law and justice, and the stars above. The lie wasn't just about darkness, it was about silence. The silence of a time made to look voiceless, when in truth it was full of arguments and ideas. And then there's the architecture. If you've ever walked into a Gothic cathedral, you've felt it. The height, the light, the impossible grace of stone that seems to float. These buildings weren't just places to pray. They were books in stone, filled with symbolism and geometry and art. How could a time supposedly lost in ignorance build something so intricate, so mathematical, so awe-inspiring? It doesn't add up. But that's the thing about lies. They're easier to believe when they're simple. And the truth is messy. It's layered. It's human. The people of the Middle Ages didn't see themselves as stuck in darkness. They believed they were part of a divine story, a living chain of knowledge passed down through centuries. They looked backward to learn and forward with hope. They dreamed, just like we do. So why were they silenced? Because if we admitted that the so-called Dark Ages were actually full of light, then we'd have to rethink the entire story we tell about civilization. And some people, especially those in power, would rather keep the story simple and keep themselves at the top. But history has a way of whispering its truth, even through the cracks, and the whispers are getting louder. There's something haunting about old manuscripts, not just the faded ink or curling parchment, but the hands that made them, quiet hands, steady under candlelight, moving patiently across the page, copying words that had already travelled centuries to reach them. These weren't mindless scribes. They were scholars, poets, monks, and rebels. They knew the power of words, and they treated every letter like gold. In their silence, they preserved the voices of Plato, Aristotle, Galen, Cicero, voices that, without their labour, might have been lost forever. But no one ever thanks them. Instead, we're told they were just copying machines in a world without thought, a world that forgot how to think until the Renaissance came to rescue it. But what if the Renaissance didn't rescue anything? What if it simply picked up a torch that had never gone out? The truth is, medieval scholars weren't just preserving the past, they were transforming it. Translating Arabic texts into Latin, debating logic and natural science, mixing Christian theology with Greek philosophy in ways that laid the foundations of modern thinking. The so-called darkness didn't come from ignorance. It came from outside forces, plagues, invasions, fractured empires, and yet, even through chaos, they kept writing, kept building, kept asking the big questions. They weren't silent, they were deliberate. But their story was stolen by men with newer pens and louder voices. Renaissance humanists scoffed at them. Enlightenment thinkers dismissed them. Victorian textbooks made them look like fools wrapped in wool, staring at the stars in fear, and the damage stuck. Even today, if someone acts old-fashioned, we call them medieval. If something feels backward or brutal, we use the word like a curse. But the irony is painful, because so many of the ideas we now celebrate were born, or at least kept alive, in that very time. Ache the idea of human rights. Long before the revolutions of modernity, medieval thinkers were already arguing about justice, divine law, and the dignity of the soul. Universities became spaces for debate, not obedience. And while the world was still far from equal or fair, the seeds of change were being planted, not in grand marble halls, but in the cold chambers of monasteries and city guilds. Still, we never gave them credit. Because giving them credit would complicate our tidy tale of progress. It would remind us that history isn't a straight line climbing out of the dark. It's a web, woven by countless hands, many of which we've forgotten on purpose. And yet, the truth is still there. You can feel it when you step into an ancient cloister and hear the echo of footsteps across stone. You can see it in the margins of a manuscript where a bored monk doodled a cat chasing a mouse. You can sense it in the very words you speak, many of which came through the medieval world, shaped by mouths now dust and bone. The lie was never just about the past, it was about shaping the present, controlling who gets remembered and who doesn't. But the past has a way of resurfacing, and when it does, it brings with it questions we were never supposed to ask. The deeper you look, the stranger it gets. Walk into any medieval town and you'll see rules written in stone, literally, carved into church walls, city gates, woven into stained glass. This wasn't a time without law or order, it was a time obsessed with both. People weren't stumbling blindly through chaos. They had guilds to protect their trades, courts to settle disputes, even codes that limited what nobles could do to their own subjects. Towns had charters, villages had customs, and if a lord broke his oath, he could be taken to court, yes, even by peasants. But that's not the story we hear. We're told that peasants lived like cattle, that knights ruled with iron fists, that kings were all-powerful. It's a story of helplessness, designed to make us believe that the people of the Middle Ages were just waiting to be saved. But the reality is more unsettling for those who want to believe in easy progress. Because these so-called peasants organised uprisings, they negotiated their rights. They built complex systems of communal land use, often more sustainable than modern ones. They knew their value, and when pushed too far, they pushed back, with surprising success. It wasn't an age of passive obedience. It was an age of negotiation, tension, and resistance. Even the idea of kingship wasn't as absolute as we've been told. Medieval rulers were often hemmed in by councils, assemblies, the church, and feudal contracts. A king couldn't just do what he pleased, not without risking rebellion, excommunication, or civil war. But saying that would ruin the narrative. It would show that power was never simple, and if the past was full of people questioning authority, organising, resisting, then we'd have to ask what else they were capable of, which is dangerous for those who want to control how history is told. So instead, we laugh at them. We mock their laws, their customs, their belief in the sacred. We say they thought disease came from demons, when many actually wrote detailed theories about contagion and sanitation. We say they lived in filth, when many towns had strict rules about waste, with fines for dirty streets and taxes to fund public latrines. Of course, things were hard, brutal even, but life wasn't just misery. It had meaning, ritual, celebration. People danced in the streets. They told stories by firelight. They crafted songs that still echo through cathedral walls. But none of that fits the myth. So the myth wins. And the people who lived real, complicated lives, full of joy and struggle and thought, get flattened into cardboard cutouts, a joke, a warning, a background setting for fantasy novels and Halloween costumes. But they were more than that. They were us. Stripped of smartphones maybe, but not stripped of humanity. And when you start to see them clearly, you start to question why someone wanted them hidden in the first place. There's a reason old cathedrals take your breath away. It's not just the size or the stained glass or the way the light pools through stone like water. It's something quieter, a feeling that the people who built them weren't as small as we think. We're told they were simple labourers, ignorant of geometry or physics, just stacking stones under orders from the church. But those walls weren't made by accident. They were drawn with precision, lifted with knowledge passed down through centuries, tuned to acoustics that could carry a whisper to the back of the nave. These buildings are books you can walk through. They're not just places to worship, they're maps of the cosmos, reflections of theology, philosophy, and engineering all wrapped into one. and they were made without computers, without blueprints, without modern machinery. So how did they do it? Because they understood more than we're told. The myth of medieval stupidity has been repeated so many times it barely gets questioned. That people didn't understand science, that they thought illness came from sin, rain came from prayer, and witches cursed your cows. But in the same centuries these beliefs circulated, people were also writing surgical manuals. They studied optics, built astronomical clocks, predicted eclipses, mapped the stars with instruments borrowed and improved from Muslim and Jewish scholars. This wasn't a world without science. It was a world full of questions and very real attempts to answer them. But science didn't look like it does today. It wore a different robe, it spoke in different metaphors, and because it wasn't branded modern, later generations dismissed it. It's easier to erase knowledge than to admit it came from people you once mocked, especially when that knowledge travelled across cultures. Arabic texts carried Greek wisdom into Europe's heart. Jewish philosophers interpreted the cosmos. Christians debated Aristotle in cold stone halls. These weren't isolated tribes. These were conversations across borders and faiths, woven together into something richer than most schoolbooks let on. But that version of the Middle Ages doesn't serve the story of Western supremacy very well, so it got edited, trimmed, cleaned up. The lie wasn't just about ignorance, it was about ownership. If you erase the brilliance of the past, you get to pretend it started with you. If you erase the Middle Ages, you get to call your revolution a beginning, not a continuation. But the echoes are still there. In the vaulted arches above your head, in the rhythms of our calendars, in the legal systems we use, the words we speak, the melodies we hum. They never really disappeared. They were just painted over, and if you listen closely, beneath the noise of modern pride, you can still hear the heartbeat of a forgotten world, steady, patient, waiting to be remembered. Somewhere, deep inside a medieval castle, there's a library few people ever talk about. Not one filled with gold leaf Bibles or royal charters, but something quieter, herbal guides, weather logs, lists of birth defects, dreams recorded under moonlight, and calculations of the stars scratched beside prayers. This wasn't a museum of superstition, it was a record of curiosity. For all the talk of the Middle Ages being ruled by blind faith, the reality was something more fragile and more honest. People believed, yes, but they also questioned, they observed, they took note of what worked and what didn't, whether it came from scripture or from soil. Medicine wasn't just leeches and incantations, it was diagnosis, experimentation, a mix of trial and error that wasn't so far from how science has always grown. Through mistakes, through repetition, through watching the world carefully, and still that world gets mocked. People imagine the medieval mind as childlike, incapable of reason, terrified of shadows. But this is the same world that debated the ethics of war, the boundaries of justice, and the structure of the cosmos long before telescopes or treaties. They weren't always right, but neither are we. And maybe that's the real threat, that they were trying to figure out the same mysteries we are, life, death, meaning, and they were doing it without our tools, without our arrogance, without the illusion that progress makes us immune to confusion. Because, in some ways, they understood things we've forgotten. They knew that light and shadow always walk together, that truth is shaped slowly, like stained glass, bit by bit, piece by jagged piece, that stories carry more power than swords, that what we choose to remember becomes the world we live in, and they knew how easy it is to forget. Even then, history was already being rewritten by kings, by bishops, by men with ink-stained fingers and reasons to lie. So they wrote what they could, hid what they had to, left notes in margins for strangers in the future, like messages in a bottle, and now, centuries later, we're just beginning to find them. In old songbooks where folk tales slip between the lines, in village records that show women healing the sick long before the word doctor was ever licensed, in letters between friends that speak of grief, of joy, of missing someone across a war. This isn't the Middle Ages we were shown. This is the Middle Ages they tried to forget. Because remembering it, truly remembering it, means seeing the past not as a failure, but as a foundation, not as darkness, but as dusk and dawn both. A time where people, just like us, tried to make sense of a world that didn't always make sense, and maybe, just maybe, left more light behind than anyone wanted us to notice. If you walk through an old village, the kind few tourists visit, you might find it, an ancient well in the centre of a forgotten square, worn stones, moss creeping up the sides, and somewhere beneath it, water that's been flowing since before anyone alive can remember. That's what medieval knowledge is like, still moving quietly, even when no one looks. We've been taught to think of the Middle Ages as a long pause, a standstill in human progress, where nothing happened, nothing improved, and no one imagined anything new. But in truth, it was a time of extraordinary transformation, just not the kind that makes flashy headlines. The real changes were quieter. A plough redesigned to cut through heavier soil, a padded collar that made it easier for horses to pull carts, a new method of rotating crops that tripled harvests. These weren't dramatic revolutions. They were small changes with enormous effects. Feeding more people, growing towns, shifting power from feudal lords to rising city guilds. But you don't hear about that, because we like our progress to come in big, dramatic bursts. We like heroes, not systems, inventions, not practices. So the story skips the details. It paints medieval people as stagnant and passive, as if they were just waiting around for someone smarter to come along and show them how things should be done. But while empires rose and fell, they were laying the bricks of the modern world. They created the first stock exchanges, drafted maritime laws, formed cooperatives and labour alliances, women ran breweries, managed estates, taught music, and in some cases practiced medicine. And yet, most of those names have been erased, because it's easier to believe history moves forward in straight lines, led by a few great men. But history isn't a line, it's a labyrinth. Winding, contradictory, full of paths that double back or vanish into silence. And in the Middle Ages, people lived inside that maze, navigating it with instincts shaped by faith, necessity, and trial. They had rules for living that may seem strange now, but many of them were rooted in something deeper than fear. They were ways to manage risk, to keep balance, to find meaning in the unknown. And when the world cracked open, through plague, through war, through famine, they didn't just collapse. They adapted, they rebuilt, they found ways to survive in a time when survival was never guaranteed. That kind of resilience doesn't come from ignorance. It comes from knowledge passed hand to hand, spoken at hearths, whispered in alleys, carved into stone when no one was watching. But that kind of knowledge doesn't fit neatly into textbooks. It's hard to measure, hard to own, hard to use as proof that you're better than the people who came before. So it gets ignored, and the lie continues. But the truth, like the water beneath that old well, never really stops. It waits, quiet, ready to rise again the moment someone remembers how to listen. It always starts the same way, a flicker of candlelight, a chill in the stone, and the sound of pages turning in the quiet. In some forgotten monastery or tucked away study, someone once leaned over parchment, not to worship, not to obey, but to wonder. To ask, what is the shape of the world? What lies beyond the stars? Why do we suffer? What is justice? These aren't modern questions, they're human questions. And they echo through the centuries, no matter how often we're told the people before us were too afraid to ask them. But they did. We just stopped listening. The lie about the Middle Ages worked because it was useful. It helped define what came after it as enlightened, rational, and new. It allowed historians, rulers, and revolutionaries to point to the past and say, "See, we're better than that." But what happens when the past starts to speak for itself? When you realize that in those dusty halls, people were developing early theories of the unconscious mind, debating whether animals had souls, and writing poetry that questioned divine order. They were not afraid of ideas. In fact, some of the boldest philosophical arguments ever written came from the medieval world. Arguments about fate, about free will, about whether the universe had always existed or had a beginning. These were thinkers willing to challenge even their own traditions, not with the loud confidence of modernity, but with a quiet, meticulous courage. And they weren't all men in robes. There were women writing theology, women composing music still performed today, women who ran their own communities, managed abbeys, negotiated with kings, and wrote visions of the cosmos so detailed they seem almost psychedelic now. But their names were buried. Some were lost beneath layers of dust. Others were erased deliberately, cut from the official record because they didn't fit the script. That's how the lie keeps growing. It feeds on silence. Every time we repeat that old story that the Middle Ages were nothing but darkness, plague, and persecution, we tighten the knot around the past, making it harder to breathe, harder to see, harder to remember what was really there. But the truth doesn't vanish just because we stop looking. It lingers in carved lintels above forgotten doors, in manuscripts tucked in boxes no one's opened in decades, in lullabies still sung in villages that don't appear on maps. The past never truly disappears. It waits for someone with the patience to trace the threads, someone willing to sit in the silence, to read the margins, to hear the voice behind the voice. And when that happens, when even one lie begins to crack, it makes space for something else. Not just facts, but understanding, the kind that whispers, softly, that the people we've been taught to forget were never really gone at all. Step into the ruins of an old fortress. The stones are cold, the wind whispers through cracks in the wall, and the sky overhead is the same sky they once looked at, centuries ago. You stand where they stood, and for a moment, time folds in on itself. You realize something. These people lived as if history mattered. They carved their beliefs into stone. Not just faith, but law, astronomy, trade routes, memories of battles they didn't want to forget. They buried time capsules beneath altars. They stitched history into tapestries, painted it into murals, sang it into songs passed from grandmother to child. But somehow, when we look back, we call them forgetful. We say they knew nothing, that they feared knowledge, that they burned books and silenced minds, that they wandered in superstition while the rest of the world waited for reason to return. But it was never that simple. Yes, there were flames. Yes, there was censorship. But there were also libraries with shelves that stretched for miles. Translation centers where Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars worked side by side. Courts where philosophers debated ethics in front of kings. Pilgrims who carried stories across mountains and deserts just to share a single idea. And yet we're told it was all shadow, because shadows are easy to control, easy to shape into cautionary tales, easy to dismiss. The lie wasn't just about history, it was about power. By casting the Middle Ages as a failure, later empires could crown themselves as saviors. By calling it barbaric, colonizers could justify conquest. By erasing the real complexity, rulers could simplify the past into a tool, a weapon even, used to guide belief, control memory, and decide whose voices would echo through the ages. But some of those voices never stopped speaking. They're etched in chapel ceilings, hidden in the footnotes of chronicles, tucked into the harmonies. of forgotten hymns. They speak of love and grief, of justice and betrayal, of moments that feel shockingly modern, because the people who lived them were not so different from us. They worried about their children, they argued about taxes, they wrestled with doubt, with faith, with the fear that maybe they weren't leaving the world any better than they found it. But still, they tried. They reached across generations with ink, stone, music, and prayer, hoping someone would remember. And now we can. Not to glorify them, not to pretend it was a golden age, but to finally let the truth breathe, to admit that the story we've been told, the one about ignorance, darkness, silence, was never the whole story. And the more we listen, the more we'll find it wasn't even close. There's a silence that hangs over history, not the silence of peace, but the silence left by those who were never allowed to speak, the stories cut short, the truths rewritten, the entire centuries folded into a single word, dark. But the Middle Ages were never silent. They were filled with voices, clashing, singing, grieving, building. Some spoke from gilded halls, others from shadowed corners, and together they created a world that was never simple, never easy to explain, and far more alive than we've been led to believe. So why did we lie? Because lies make us feel superior. They make history look like a ladder, and us, the ones standing at the top. They turn the people of the past into ghosts so we don't have to see ourselves in their reflection. But what if they weren't so different? What if the fears they had are still our fears? What if their questions are still ours? What if the same hunger for meaning, for justice, for beauty, still beats inside us centuries later? Then the lie begins to break, and in its place, something more human rises. Not a myth of perfect progress, not a fairy tale of endless ignorance, but a tapestry threaded with contradiction, glory and grief, wisdom and cruelty, invention and superstition, stitched together by people who were trying, just like we are, to make sense of their world. And they left behind more than ruins. They left behind cathedrals that defy gravity, legal systems that still shape our courts, languages that built our stories, and questions, so many questions, still echoing in the quiet corners of our libraries, our dreams, and our doubt. The Middle Ages were never lost. They were buried beneath shame, mockery, and 1,000 years of oversimplified storytelling. But history has roots, and roots, no matter how deep you try to hide them, always remember where they came from. So when someone tells you that the past was no thing but darkness, pause. Listen a little longer. Read between the lines. Look at what was left behind by hands no one remembers, but whose work still holds up the world. Because maybe the truth was never that they lived in the dark. Maybe the truth is that someone turned off the lights, so we'd never know how much they had already seen.